Finally, let's look at a common form of moral obfuscation, euphemisms and indirect speech. With a couple of my colleagues, Alex Shackroff and Leanne Young, we discussed some findings that demonstrate what Bandura is talking about here, moral disengagement through language. In the study by Shackroff et al. In Cognitive Science in 2015, participants online took part in an experiment where they read about a protagonist who is either themselves in one condition or a stranger, someone else in the other condition. And this protagonist made a direct or an indirect unethical proposition. And the researchers wanted to know, what is the effect of direct or indirect language on response to an unethical proposition? In the study, the indirect propositions included statements like this bribe shrouded in euphemism. Hey, any chance we can get some great service tonight? The direct proposition, by contrast, was, hey, any chance I can pay you to get seated early? The participants read and evaluated statements with either themselves as the speaker, like you ask the host, or with some stranger named Steve. Steve asks the host. The researchers wanted to know if indirect speech was morally evaluated differently for the self versus somebody else. To explore people's evaluations, they asked participants about a number of dependent variables. First, their own likelihood of making the proposition. Second, how much using indirect speech would affect accountability. How likely would you or Steve be to get off the hook after this proposition? Third, they asked about the moral permissibility of the proposition, how much they viewed the behavior as the right thing to do. And finally, they asked about their confidence that the intended message would get across. And this gauged whether they thought the message was ambiguous or not. So what did they find? This chart indicates the mean evaluations for all the dependent variables when participants read direct and indirect speech. The direct speech is indicated in the darker gray and indirect speech in the lighter gray. These results right here are collapsing across role, self, or other, so that's important to note. These results indicate that, first, the materials were right on. They were less confident that the indirect message was conveyed compared to when the speech was direct. Second, people generally rated indirect messages as more likely to get a person off the hook than direct messages. So they inferred that these less clear indirect messages reduced accountability. And people thought they'd be more likely to deliver indirect messages. And importantly, that indirect messages were more morally permissible than direct messages. The next question is, is their moral permissibility, though, identical for the self versus the other? That's what we need to ask to get at their big question. Bandura's theory proposes that we use indirect speech like this to disengage from our own self-sanctions for immoral behavior, not necessarily to let others off the hook. To understand this, we need to compare moral permissibility ratings for the self and the other person, Steve. This graph shows what was found. Moral permissibility differed between the self and other condition. Participants found it significantly more permissible to engage in indirect speech when they themselves did it than when they judged the other, Steve. This can be seen in the difference between the dark gray bars in the graph. There was no difference in their perceptions of accountability, though, whether indirect speech gets you off the hook. They report that it got them off the hook and Steve off the hook similarly. But again, for themselves, it's less wrong. This is fitting with what Bandura proposes, that we construe our own behavior as more morally acceptable than the same behavior done by others. Maybe the results of Shackroff and colleagues' first study fit with your intuitions. Most people would think it's less wrong to check their answers, indirect speech, than cheat on a test, direct speech, and that they'd be more likely to do the indirectly worded act, checking their answers, than cheating. But does thinking about cheating as checking your answers make you more likely to do it? And is this because it seems less wrong to you? That's what the researchers wanted to understand in their second study. So study 2 examines a more consequential question. Do participants believe they'll be more likely to perform a transgression when it's worded indirectly? To investigate whether participants believe they'd be more likely to perform an indirectly worded transgression, they asked participants online to read scenarios that described a protagonist, who is either the participant or a stranger again, acting unethically in morally neutral terms. For example, Sarah glanced at someone else's test answers and changed some of her own answers. They varied directness. They did this with short redescriptions of the act that were either indirect or direct. For example, how likely would you be to do this? Check your answers, or in the direct speech condition, to cheat on the test. They measured 2 DVs in this study, likelihood and also the moral permissibility of the act. Participants made either all likelihood judgments first or all permissibility ratings first, and they counterbalanced the order across participants and found no effect of the order. The researchers found first that indirect descriptions increased reported likelihood relative to direct, and indirect descriptions increased the perceived moral permissibility of the act. This is in line with their hypothesis that indirect speech can increase the likelihood of immoral acts and make them seem less wrong. But does it do this when I think about my own acts or anybody's acts? If indirect speech is a mechanism of moral disengagement, then it should affect these kinds of judgments more for the self or people associated with the self than just anybody. They ran mediation tests, and indeed, they found that indirect speech increased the perceived likelihood of one's own unethical acts by making them seem more morally permissible. This mediation was only present for the self. People don't perceive others' acts as more likely because they're more permissible, they're indirectly worded acts. So it appears that indirect speech makes us think we'll be more likely to choose to act unethically because it makes our moral judgments of our own unethical acts more lenient. We can summarize the finding with this illustration. The key finding is that the perceived likelihood of one's own unethical behaviors was increased when the behavior was presented in indirect, obscure terms. And this effect of indirect speech on behavior was mediated by moral permissibility ratings. Indirect speech increases the likelihood of one's own unethical acts by making them seem more morally permissible. So this is some nice evidence in support of Bandura's theory. The authors note, in everyday social interactions, the benefits of indirect speech use may not be realized through a conscious, effortful application of Machiavellian social strategies, but rather through the simple desire to act in morally permissible ways. Here, the authors are presenting these findings not as evidence that humans are broadly manipulative Machiavellians. Rather, they're proposing that people are motivated to act in alignment with what's morally right. This doesn't mean they always achieve that. As we see here, our strong motivation to be morally right may motivate obscuring messages that make unethical acts seem acceptable and then more likely. People are likely unaware of the moral implications of using indirect speech and its potential conflict with the desire to act in morally permissible ways. This is in alignment with a large literature on motivated cognition that explores how people may be unaware at an explicit or conscious level of the full and sometimes unethical implications of their putatively moral beliefs and judgments. We're so motivated to avoid dissonant thoughts and aversive emotions that we bring our beliefs and judgments in line with what we most value or with our moral worldview.